Okay, hello. Welcome to October the 22nd. Is that right? It is right. So we're coming up on 2 full months in, mm, which is pretty remarkable. Right. Okay, so to jump right to it. Today, our subject for the week is dreams. So what we're going to talk about, I know that this is something that has sort of distinctly excited people. In the course, and often it is sort of a unique point of attraction for people that are interested in Jungian studies. As I've mentioned previously, dreams are a curious entry to the unconscious. They have, of course, the benefit, I think, uniquely of being, an altered state that we access on a regular basis, right? So we access every night, and that, unlike many other exogenous altered states, are it's recuperative. So in fact, if we don't dream, we're in trouble. So in that sense, because it's good for us and because we do it all the time anyway, it's a particular altered state which gives us sort of unconscious access for interpretive purposes in different ways. And of course, it's spontaneously occurring all the time. That's very helpful. So it's responsive in a way, even when we're not looking for it. But there are also some unique aspects to dream as a way of exploring the unconscious. And I hope that in talking about it a bit, you will get a grasp, if you don't already have one, on why indeed dream is deemed to be sort of the royal road to the unconscious, as Freud put it. Sure, it was Freud, not Jung. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about dreams. However, first, before we talk about dreams, I want to talk a little bit about interpretation. So, as per the standard, I'm going to do 2 separate hours this week, right? So there will be 2 separate hours of lecture. The first hour will be about interpretation, and the second hour will be on dreams specifically. And the reason is that, for the most part, when we're talking about dream, right, within the Jungian context, we're talking about dream interpretation. We're talking about dream as a locus to be in contact with one's complexes, one's, sort of archetypal images, right? It's the area where we're encountering these other forces within our psyche in some more direct and dramatic way. But there is a specific framework that one uses to get at these things. And Jungian dream interpretation is not the same as other schools of dream interpretation. It has some unique factors. Before we can even get to those factors, we need to talk a little bit about interpretation and how it works. So that's this first bit, interpretation, okay? Okay, so it's important when we're looking at symbolism of any kind, okay? So when we're looking at symbolism within a story, when we're looking at symbolism within a dream, when we're looking at symbolism within a myth, et cetera, painting, whatever, right? The way in which we interpret that symbolism is necessarily quite variable. Okay, it's necessarily quite variable. And a lot of the time, I find that people get hung up when they're trying to do interpretation. Specifically, I'm looking for the right interpretation. Now, those of you who come to discussion in office hours will be familiar with this a little bit, but I think James actually referenced it in his presentation. But I'm going to run through this again for your benefit because I think it's important to bear, okay? So there's a thing that I observed many years ago, okay, looking at the problems of metaphor. And I taught high school English for quite a while back in the day. And when I was in high school English, and also when I taught high school English, I observed something that was really kind of consistent, okay? So every year we had a poetry unit, right? There would be part of the English course that would be a poetry unit. And when the poetry unit came up, it would always garner the same response, right? When I was in those classes, and then later when I was teaching them, the teacher or the other teacher would say, okay, so next week is the poetry unit, and 2/3 of the class would go, ugh, and 1/3 of the class would go, yay. And at the time, I'm firmly in the yay camp, just to be clear. So at the time, I found this puzzling. Like when I was a student, I was like, I don't get it. Like, what do people have against poetry, And then later when I was a teacher, I was given to thinking about it considerably more deeply, and I realized that there's a few things going on. So I'm going to run this idea past you, and then we'll unpack it a little bit further. So for one thing, okay, within the West, and especially within North America, we have to a great extent lost contact with our poetic traditions. Okay, so time was when being a poet, poet laureate, poet in residence, something of this kind had a fair bit of currency in our culture, right? But now poetry is very minor. I mean, most of us only encounter poetry in really a few ways. We encounter it in lyrics, which is to say either sort of song lyrics or hip hop or rap lyrics, right? Which is just poetry. It's just poetry. And so, that's sort of the dominant. We encounter it in greeting cards, basically, right? And every once in a while, we are given to write a poem if we happen to be of the temperament and the mood strikes us, right? So you can certainly be in the kind of literary subset who follows such things, but it doesn't have a lot of mass following, right? When in this culture we consider people writing poetry, we're often sort of imagining, brooding teenagers or love-struck young people or something. It's really unfair characterization, but that tells you a bit about where poetry sort of has been relegated to in our culture. Now, that was not always the case, obviously, right? So, a thing I say fairly frequently is, if you are not reading the classics and you are not reading the Bible, you're broadly speaking missing out on the source code of Western culture, right? And you can really see this, you roll the clock back 150 years and you read, speeches that were in the House of Commons or something, right, in Ottawa. And what you'll get is these speeches that are really, really dense with metaphor, right? Really dense with metaphor. And the interesting thing is, much of the metaphor that gets used is drawn from either Greco-Roman classics or the Bible. Shockingly, these things were considered, right, the bedrock foundation of education, and so they were consumed. It was just assumed that if somebody made a basic biblical reference that you could follow it. So if you said to somebody old as Methuselah, right, that was just a relatively transparent reference for them, right? For those of you who don't know, Methuselah is the single oldest calculated age in the Bible. They live to be almost 1,000, 960 something, I think. But anyway, the point is, right, Methuselah is sort of the Bible lists how long people lived in various places in the Old Testament. Methuselah is the longest lived. So to be old as Methuselah is a reference to that would have been held largely in common by virtually everybody. Same thing, right? If you were to reference the classics, people would pick that stuff up pretty easily. Now, there are remnants of that, obviously, that occur. So, you can make reference to Hercules, or more properly Heracles, and people will understand that means, heroic and strong. People might pick up Atlas and the idea that Atlas is holding up the world, right? Something like that. But the point is that the substrate isn't there in the same way. When you listen to modern political speeches, read modern articles and stuff, it doesn't employ that language of metaphor in the same way as it used to. And because people are not as widely read in that kind of stuff, it means that what we lack is the same degree of shared metaphorical language, right? And therefore, poetry doesn't have the same kind of substrate to operate in. We are either forced to come up with sort of novel poetic devices, right? Or to reference pop culture, right? Or, if you're in the insider track, you can reference literature, but more often than not, it's those other things. Now, you can get some currency out of that, obviously, right? I think people have gotten lots and lots and lots of mileage out of, referencing The Matrix, for instance, right? Which is just a bunch of ancient and Cartesian philosophy blended together. But the point is, The Matrix is a more current reference. So the point is, right, our poetic culture has really withered here to a great extent. Now, this is not so everywhere in the world. So, for instance, American Idol, as we all know, is a competition for musical performers, and its sort of analog in the Middle East are poetry contests. Very specifically, poetry contests, and poetry has a really living cultural presence there in a way that it does not here. Okay, so So we don't have the same kind of living tradition of poetry. We don't have the same kind of shared metaphoric substrate. And so it's difficult for people to write poetry. But correspondingly, it's also difficult for people to interpret poetry, to interpret the metaphors in question. Now, that's one thing, right? That the sort of shared substrate has, eroded to a significant extent. So we don't have the shared metaphorical language with which to access poetry. So that's part of it. But the other part of it, I realized, after many years of sort of teaching English in this respect, right? I realized that the 2/3 of the class who was going, were doing that because they sort of didn't know how to access poetry. Now, when I say this, what do I mean? Poetry is this highly, highly concentrated form of language, right? It's as much as people, I think, think of it as being sort of throwaway, and it's not. But poetry is a far more concentrated form of language than prose or technical language. Technical language expands things out to make sure that it is very clear, but poetry has concentrated force to it, concentrated emotional force, and often concentrated sort of intuitive imagistic force. But one of the problems that we have with the way that poetry is taught, and thus people's sort of appreciation of it, is that people get very hung up on the interpretation of specific symbols. So a pretty common, right? A pretty common assignment around poetry would be like, here's a poem, name all the poetic devices, right? That's not especially interesting, right? And then interpret the poem. What does it mean? Okay, now here is where we get hung up on on one tiny word. Is. The word is. I-S is. Okay, why is this a hang-up? It's a hang-up for two reasons. Two very important reasons. Because it means two different things. Is doesn't mean one thing. It means two things. But we use these two meanings very nearly interchangeably in common speech. We don't think about it too much. Okay, so one meaning of the word is, okay, is like an equal sign, logical identity. So if I say to you, 2 + 2 is 4, what I mean is 2 + 2 equals 4. And what's an equal sign? An equal sign, right? An equal sign in a mathematical equation tells you that the two sides of the equation are two different ways of expressing the same thing. They have logical identity, right? The formulation might be different. They might be different in appearance, but that they have the same logical identity. That's what an equal sign means. So 2 + 2 is 4 means 2 + 2 equals 4. That's logical identity. And that's one way we use the word is. But a far more common way that we use the word is analogically, okay? Not logically, but analogically. And when we, analogy, right? When we use the word is analogically, we do not mean logical equivalency. We don't mean equals. We mean something more like is like, right? Has selected aspects in common with, right? And of course, there is some work involved in figuring out what those aspects are. Those of you that are sort of familiar with this angle in cognitive science will be familiar with the way that you sort of transfer, right, terms from one side to the other. So, if you say Jim is a pig, right? What are you meant to take from this? Well, you're meant to take that maybe he's slovenly, maybe he's not very nice to women, right? He's messy, he's kind of gross, right? Like those are the things that you transfer, right, from pig to Jim. What you don't transfer, right, are a bunch of other traits, right? If I say Jim is a pig, you don't take from that, oh, Jim has a pink curly tail, check, right? That's not what you do. You manage to zone in on these specific things. You might, if you have this particular turn, think I mean Jim is a police officer, right? But that's pretty specific. The point is, right, there's a specific transfer. This is bouncing off much of John Vervaeke's work. So some of you will be familiar with this, some of you won't. But the point is, right, there are specific things. And you can use those sorts of features to make sort of bad jokes, right? It's the one he tells, it's so bad. Oh yes, I picked up my girlfriend the other night and she looked like $1 million, all green and crinkly. Okay, so what's going on there, right? we sort of grumble laugh. It's like a dad joke, right? We grumble laugh, and we grumble laugh because it's like a cheap joke, because it's deliberately priming us for the idiom looks like $1,000,000, meaning looks very good, right? But instead substitutes in green and crinkly the way that paper money would be, right? So it's an inappropriate transfer that causes the joke. Okay, so the point is there are these two different forms of the word is. One is an equal sign, logical equivalency, and the other is a kind of transfer of aspects where we are meant to learn about the thing that it is being compared to. Okay, good with me so far? All right. Well, why I'm asking, you can't respond. The guinea pigs are responding. Okay, so we've got these two different uses of the word is, and we do not typically disambiguate them. And so people very often, when they hit the poetry section of the English class, and right, the reason is that nobody has ever bothered disambiguating these two uses, and then the way that you build an argument with those two uses of the word is, the logical versus the analogical, right? Logical arguments versus analogical arguments. The consequence of that is that they go looking for logical equivalency. Okay, so what does that mean? They go looking for the right answer. Singular, uno, the right answer, the right answer. That's what they go looking for. So they hit a poem, and here's this metaphor, and the task is, okay, identify all the parts of speech. That's insanely boring, right? Or identify the various literary devices. It's like, oh, right? It's important to know, but at the same time, it's not very interesting typically. And then, you take a particular symbol and you attempt to interpret it. And the assumption is there is one right answer. What's the right answer? Because if it were a math problem, there would be a right answer. There would be a single correct thing to fill in after the equal sign. The thing is that with analogical interpretation, it doesn't work like that. You can't run one single argument like that. Arguments are instead a question of structural plausibility, right? Comparative structural plausibility. Okay, what do I mean by this? So this is where James already referenced something here, so I'll fill this in a little bit. Okay, here's how it works. Imagine that instead of this rainy, terrible business that we have outside, or it might not be raining where you are, but here in Toronto, let me assure you, it is raining. So let's assume that instead of this rainy nonsense, and instead of having to be masked up and stay at range from each other, instead, it was a very nice day, and we as a class had undertaken an expedition to go to the park. And at the park, just for grounding reference, let's say we go to Christie Pitts. So we go to Christie Pitts, and it's a beautiful day out. And so we all lie on the grassy sward, and we lie back, and we put our arms behind our head, and we're staring. And it's the kind of nice day where it's like a striking, beautiful blue, but there are clouds in the sky. Great big, fluffy puff cotton clouds, okay, floating by. Right? Not dominating, but here they come. Here's one, here's another, here's another. So we're lying on our back, okay? And I say, hey, look at that cloud. It looks like a turtle, right? Look at that cloud. It looks like a turtle. Okay. And you squinch up at the same cloud, it's like that one. Okay. And you say, what are you talking about? The cloud doesn't look like a turtle. It looks like a cowboy. Okay. How does the argument proceed from here? Well, the answer is, what do? I say, no, look, it looks like a turtle, right? See, there's its head, there are the feet, and that's the shell, see? And you say, no, you've got it totally wrong. What you're seeing as a shell is actually the saddle. See, there's the bump, and that's the horse's legs, and that's the cowboy's legs, and there's the top, and there's the cowboy hat, right? Okay, so we're pointing at the cloud, and we're making comparative featural structural comparisons. That is what we are doing, right? Isomorphism, if you want the spot geometry term. So isomorphism, okay? Look at the shape of it, and here is one point of the shape, and see how it corresponds to the thing, and here, da-da-da-da-da. Now, if there were other people listening to us, right, as we talked back and forth, they might weigh in on this, right? They might say, yeah, Anderson, you're crazy. It doesn't look like a turtle. It definitely looks like a cowboy. Or they might say, you're right, it kind of looks like a turtle, but it really looks more like a cowboy. Or they might propose an entirely third interpretation. Both of you are wrong. It looks neither like a turtle nor a cowboy, but a double-humped camel. Okay. And if they did so, they would then run their own structural featural comparison. They would say, see, there's da, 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 and other people would judge accordingly. Okay. So cloud watching. Now, the thing is, note that none of us are making a claim of logical equivalency. It's not what we're doing. We're not saying that the cloud is a turtle, right? Not actually. But what we are saying is that it closely structurally resembles a turtle. That's the argument that we're making, right? And notice that it's not the case, if I point at it in sort of the absence of discourse and say it's a turtle, it's not that it doesn't resemble a turtle at all. It's just that when we get down to, a disagreement of interpretation or how well our interpretation fits the features of the thing, right? That's when argumentation starts to occur, right? Oh, right. And people can kind of look at it on the basis of, right, here are the points, da, 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 da. Right. It looks more like a this than a that, right? I might sell everybody on my turtle interpretation. And then when you come along with your cowboy interpretation, everybody might be right. Yes, it actually does look more like a cowboy, right? And our interpretation of the cloud is going to flip accordingly. Likewise, I might not argue with it all. You might suggest cowboy, and I might immediately go, damn, you're right, cowboy. Okay, so why is this relevant? Because for the most part, doing interpretation on things, okay, in the way that we're talking about, is analogical interpretation. And analogical interpretation is more like cloud watching than it is like math. You can't just crunch through the factors and get to bing, and there's the answer, right? It just doesn't work like that. Instead, what you're doing is this structural featural comparison stuff along analogical lines, right? This distinction in the term is. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit more about this, obviously, when we talk about dreams, but an important thing to remember, okay, an important thing to remember is that, when you're doing dream interpretive work, that it's not accidental. The symbols aren't accidental. So the reason I bring this up is that, like poetry, okay, you get a symbol in a dream and you get, somebody had whatever, and then there was a beaver in the background, right? And, whatever the dream was, they're like, oh, there's a beaver. And very often our tendency is to just brush that aside, right? Why a beaver? Whatever, a beaver. And the point is that, like a poem, okay, nothing is accidental. Nothing is snuck into the dream and it's just like bleh, garbage. Including, I add, every time somebody has a dream, and what they do is they write off the contents as, well, I was thinking about that right before I went to sleep, or I was talking about that with my friend the other day. When those contents show up, you've talked about a lot of things in the last 2 days. You thought about a lot of things before you sleep. Not all of them make it into your dreams. And so the things that do make it into your dreams have been very specifically chosen. Now, why does that matter? Coming back to interpretation. So when we consider poetic interpretation, right, one way that you can kind of get at poetic interpretation and interpretation generally, okay, is by a field of substitution. A field of substitution. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, so let's start with a very simple, terrible poem. Okay, so here's the poem. My love for her is an eagle. My love for her is an eagle. This is a terrible poem, I think. Maybe it's better than I think. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, my love for her is an eagle. Okay, so let's say that you were starting that. That's like a one analogical transfer poem, right? We should be able to figure this out. Okay, so it's about love. Love is the thing that is being modified here. And it is an eagle, not like an eagle. Did I say like an eagle? My love for her is an eagle, okay? You could say like an eagle, same difference, simile metaphor in this but our point is, right? Okay, so what about an eagle? Like, okay, so how did we start in on this? Well, what's an eagle? That's the first question we would ask. What's an eagle? Okay, so an eagle is a bird. Okay, it's a bird. What kind of bird is it? It's a national bird. It's a jingoistic bird. Okay, sure. It's large. It's a big bird, not to be confused with Sesame Street's eponymous Big Bird. Sure, it's a big bird. What else? It's a predator. It's noble looking. It's dangerous. It's high flying, it's keen eyed. Okay, right? So we can play with those traits a little bit and be like, my love for her. Okay. Now, if you want to clarify down, right, a little bit, you can start substituting in sort of things within the field. So first you take the category, right? In this case, bird, right? Okay, bird. So let's say that we take the same piece and we start substituting in other terms, other birds. Okay, so bearing in mind that we started with, my love for her is an eagle. Okay, now I want you to sort of pause for a second and feel with your mind, okay, feel with your mind these various substitutions. My love for her is a vulture. My love for her is a penguin. My love for her is a hummingbird. My love for her is a sparrow. My love for her is an albatross. My love for her is an emu. My love for her is an ostrich. My love for her is a dodo. My love for her is a raven. My love for her is an owl. Okay, that's probably enough to start with. Okay, now as I was saying that, I'm assuming that probably you got sort of different sorts of impressions basically off of each one, right? Like they're different. Yes, they share the category of bird, but notice that when we start substituting in and out different terms in the same category, right, we get a wildly different kind of thing, right? When I suddenly substitute in my love for her is a vulture, right? Like that's clearly much worse, right? I'm sure vultures are very nice birds, but obviously, right, they have bad sort of cultural reputation and associations for us because they eat dead flesh and they circle around in the desert waiting for you to die, and they're sort of bald and squawky and ugly and whatever, right? My love for her is a vulture makes the interpretation sort of suggest that maybe like my love for her is circling around waiting for her to die. Like what does that mean, right? Okay, same goes, right? You can go across the thing, penguin, it's like it's ungainly, it's cold, looks like it's wearing a tux. I mean, you can sort of go to these different things, you're going to get very different feel out of each of them. Okay, now go back to my love for her is an eagle. And all of a sudden, the eagleness of the eagle stands out quite a bit relative to those other terms, right? Stands out a bit relative to those other terms. So you can do a certain amount of substitution, okay? Now, it's important when you're doing a poetry analysis, symbol analysis generally, mythic analysis, dream analysis within the Jungian frame, that you take the thing that is there for what it is. Okay, so this is, as I'll point out on the other side again, but this is a big distinction between Freudian and Jungian dream analysis, right? In Freudian dream analysis, there is a kind of symbolic collapse, right? So, right, this is the sort of pivot point of lots and lots and lots of Freudian jokes, but right, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? Except the rest of the time it's a penis. I mean, that's the whole thing. Not the whole thing, that's unfair, but it does form a part of the interpretive framework. You got stabbed by a knife, penis. You're using a pen, penis. There was a long cane, penis. I ate a cucumber sandwich, penis, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so the point is that there's this collapse on the basis of general morphology within Freudian dream interpretation, where like long, thin things are meant to collapse down into a specific symbolic resonance. Not so in Jungian interpretation. So in Jungian dream interpretation, if there's a knife, that's a different thing than if there are scissors. And it's a different thing, okay, than if there's a pen. And it's a different thing than if there's a cigar, okay? In Jungian dream interpretation, a cigar is a cigar, right? It doesn't stand in that important sense for something else, okay? And what I mean by this is this, right? Like, that doesn't mean that there aren't underlying symbolic interpretive things to be done, but it means that the specificity of the symbol is actually important. There's a reason that it's a cigar and not something else, right? Another way that I put this, sometimes I say, it's like poetry, right? The words in poetry, they're not accidental. No words got into a poem by accident. Another way that I sometimes put it is that dreams are less like films and more like animation, okay? In a film, you watch an old film, that's like a biblical epic. You watch the Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur or something, if you've seen those movies. And like you'll see they have like 10,000 extras dressed up like Romans, right? And one of them will walk by and he'll be wearing a wristwatch. And that's one of those things you used to see in these old films, right? You'd see these bloopers where stuff made it in accidentally. Or if you happen to know Star Wars, there's this classic scene where the stormtrooper comes into the room and once you see it, you can't unsee it. He walks in and he goes, dunk. Like there's a dunk. He knocks his head right off this thing and it makes a noise, an audible sound, Okay, those are accidents. Nobody intended that to be in there, right? That did not occur on purpose, right? That wristwatch, nobody was like, aha, this is the scene with the time traveler. That's not what's happening. Instead, somebody just forgot to take their damn watch off and the people in charge didn't catch it. But in animation, that doesn't happen, right? In animation, that doesn't happen. If you watch a Disney movie or you watch an animated series or what have you, right? If there's a detail, if somebody walks by with a wristwatch, somebody had to draw it. It didn't get in there by accident. Somebody had to go in there and deliberately add it. This is the same with dream interpretation in the Jungian framework, okay? The details aren't by accident. They are specific, okay? And we'll get more into the specificity on the other side, but the point is, because of that, you need to treat things for what they are. And so localizing them in this way, right? If we were going to do that kind of poetic interpretation, right? Sometimes substituting a little bit can give you some feel about the specificity of a particular object, right? So indeed, if I had a dream and it contained an eagle, my go-to first might be, well, it's a bird. But then to get the specificity of that bird, right, it's helpful for me to substitute in other potential things. Well, if it had been this, how does that make me feel? If it had been this, how does that make me feel, right? And those things let me kind of narrow in, okay? But this is important. There's no stable, super final answer. If the poem is, right, my love for her is an eagle, right? You're not going to be able to come down with an equals sign answer for what that means. All you will be able to come up with is featural structural comparison, isomorphism. You'll be able to say, well, an eagle is a noble bird, an eagle flies high, and like that, his love, blah, 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 right? Now, you might say then, it's like, well, okay, if there's no single answer, then like there's no truth. And I would say, no, no, that's not true. Or rather, I don't think so, right? The fact that something is analogical and doesn't stabilize down into a single answer just means that it's part of the, frankly, far larger category of the world. Most information is of that form. It's actually the rare thing that we can code into an equation and give an equal sign to. It's useful when we can do that, obviously. I got nothing against logical equivalency. But analogical reasoning is far more common and, frankly, more powerful than logical equivalency in many, many contexts. So, okay, another quick comparison I'm going to give you on the interpretation front, just to sort of fill this idea out. So, one of the comparisons that I have sometimes used for people is that when you're running an analogical argument, it's a structural comparative argument, okay? It's a little bit like investigating a fossil. Okay, so let's say that I find a fossil, right? A rock, and it's got bones embedded in it. And I'm trying to figure out something about the animal, and I'm looking at its pattern. Okay, it's about its pattern of bones. And I'll see that it has like a wing. Okay, so it's like a bat kind of thing. So it has a wing. Now, if you look at a bat wing, what do you see? Well, a bat wing, essentially speaking, is a hand, right? It's a hand. It's a big stretched out hand with skin stretched between, right? That's what a bat wing is. How would we establish this? Well, we would go through morphological comparison. We would take a look and we would say, well, look, here, if you look at the fossil, there are the various phalanges. And you can see that they map to the much smaller, right, phalanges of comparable related organisms. But the point is, you're like, oh, this morphologically, right, is, right, here is the thumb and here is the, right? You would look at the fossil and draw that comparison. That kind of morphological comparison, frankly, is how we traditionally ended up classifying most organisms. Not all of them these days. A lot of the time now we use genetic techniques, and that's led to some real surprises. But for the most part, we did our categorizations in precisely this way. We looked at patterns of morphological similarity, right? And comparison points. Notice how doing that kind of work on a fossil could be also predictive, right? Because let's say that the fossil is missing these two bones, okay? So if I was saying, oh, I see, structurally speaking, these are phalanges, like these are phalanges, okay? And I would say, well, they're quite elongated compared to what we see in the species. But normally we would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phalanges. We only see 3 here, and there's a break off in the fossil. I would therefore predict that there are 2 additional phalanges, right? Okay, so what's that? It's an inferential argument from comparative isomorphic structure. Now, you may wonder why I'm getting into this at this level. And the thing is, it's because these kinds of arguments are going to form, in many respects, the backbone of your interpretive arguments when you're doing work for this course. That's how it's going to work, right? So what you are very often going to do, yeah, of course, you're going to use a Jungian framework to some extent. So you're going to, right? But like most of the time, what you're going to be doing is going into a text, right? Typically, or a phenomenon, if you happen to go that way. But you'll be going into a text a lot of the time, and you'll be saying, okay, looking in this text, so-and-so is this structure, and so is this structure. And when this happens, it's analogous to this. And then you'll be, building your argument, quoting things, and showing that the structures are comparable. That's how you'll be running your interpretive arguments. Your interpretive arguments fundamentally are cloud watching. See this, 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 this. Well, we can see those as this. And you'll note that, like cloud watching, the dominant structure, right, in this, and the way that we make the decision is not by absolute deductive truth, like it is with a logical inference. Rather, it is by plausibility, right? It's by plausibility. If you run the argument and everybody else on the hill goes, I don't think it does look like a turtle, right? Well, then you clearly have not given a very compelling structural argument, right? That's basically how it works. Now, I mean, I don't know, that's between you and God. Maybe it does look more like a turtle. But the point is, right, like you need to be able to run your structural comparison in such a way as to plausibly point out that there is a similarity. And then, very often, right, from those plausible similarities, make inferences that allow you to usefully extend. Okay, now, for some of you, this is all going to be incredibly abstract. And at this point, you're going to be going like, what the are we even talking about? That's fine. We're going to come back around to interpretation. Because interpretation as a method, okay, has an incredibly old pedigree, obviously, within Western culture. Analogical reasoning goes way, 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 way back. And it precedes science to a really important extent. So, we know that the methods of knowledge production prior to the scientific method were predominantly methods that were based on resemblance. And there are problems with those methods, but nevertheless, they did allow us to construct systems that we use to navigate the world. And although those systems do not typically do an especially good job in navigating sort of objective physical reality, they are very good at navigating psychological reality. They're very good at navigating psychological reality. So doing that kind of interpretive move, right, that sort of structural thing, that the cloud watching kind of move, right, is going to be really, really central to doing dream work and mythic interpretation. Okay, so I wanted to go over that at some length. I'm trying to think, was there anything else in sort of this front line on interpretation that I wanted to talk about specifically? I mean, there are a lot of things that we could talk about in this sort of field, but I think probably this will suffice for this first thing. So try to sort of remember those general points as we're getting in a dream. Oh, this one's coming in a little short. That's good. Try to remember those general points when we're talking about dream, right? And the interpretation of dream. There isn't a single answer, okay? Oh, I will say one more thing about that, actually. That's especially striking when you're actually doing dream interpretive work with people, because, of course, what you do is you wait for it to hit them, spark insight, right? So, and typically speaking, you don't give your interpretation. That's not done that much anymore. You play around with the material with them until something suddenly connects for them, and it becomes highly meaningful in some ways. Sometimes maybe you know, but you don't want to nudge things too much. You don't want too much of it to come from you. So what's the deciding factor? The deciding factor is insight, that it snaps in. Why? Because at that moment, it suddenly, right? Again, it's the transfer. It suddenly provides a bunch of useful additional explanatory material. Oh, if it's a blank, then all of a sudden, and it opens up a bunch of stuff, right? So that's how it works in the dream framework, is that with the right thing, all of a sudden there is this insightful transfer, okay? Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to say now for interpretation 1, and then you can carry those principles on as we are talking about dream. I'll come back to interpretation and the sort of the interpretive and hermeneutic frameworks. We'll talk about that later, but no overload. Just try to grab those principles now, and we will talk about dream presently.